Hey, so now in this lecture we'll be talking about the iterations and loops, and we'll code an example that is related to an example that we did in the previous lecture where we created points and colored them a little. So in this lecture we'll do similar things, but we'll use iterations to create many points in one go. So I'll show you the usefulness of the for loop, and that will be one example of how you can create automatically many points in one go. So let's get started, and let's do what we do always. I guess you will just learn this by heart to do next time. And yeah, so now we've created the boilerplate context, and let's again create a grid as we did in the previous lecture. This is always useful. So let's declare grid options. Let's say that it's that. And let's draw the grid. Let's see if that works. So that works fine. Okay, now, so what we did last time, we created vectors, if you remember correctly. So we will do a similar thing now, but we will create arrays that hold colors and that hold multiple vectors, multiple three-dimensional points. So let's start by declaring a constant that will hold the colors, and let's give it a type string array. And now we can initialize it to an empty array. So what this means is that the array is empty and it can be filled later. So it still can be a constant, but it's gonna be expanded later on. So not redefined, but expanded. You create a sort of bucket to which you will be adding items. And you don't need to define the length of it or anything. TypeScript and JavaScript both are flexible in that sense. Arrays can just be arbitrary length buckets. So let's go further, and let's say that we will also be creating vectors. And vectors in bit by bit are declared by bit inputs, base, and point 3. So this means that vector must have 3 numbers in it. So this means that if I create a container that is empty, that is legal. If I create the container that has 3 points, that is fine. But I have a container that has 2 numbers, that's not good anymore. So if you go and have 3, then it's fine. If you have 4, that's not fine anymore. So basically, you must have 3 items in the array to define a point. The same is for the vector. It's the same data structure. They are interchangeable in bit by bit, and you can just say that this will be representing a point coordinates here. Okay, so we have 2 buckets, and we'll be initiating them both as empty arrays. And that's because we will be filling them in the iteration loop that we will create. So we create the for loop like this. So let's do that. Let's initiate the y to 0. Let's say that the y needs to become less than 255 and increase the y with each iteration by 1. And that's the notation for it. What will happen with this for loop is that the body will be ran 255 times. And why 255 times? It's because in computer graphics, RGB colors are encoded between 0 and 255. And that's just a notation that is useful, and I'll show you how to create the colors by using the numbers instead of the hexadecimal notation that we've seen in the previous lecture, which is much harder to read and understand. So let's jump in, and let's say that we want to create a color. So let's create a color, and let's say that the color needs to be bit by bit color RGB to hex. So we want the colors to be strings because that's what bit by bit takes as an input always. And you can produce the hexadecimal notation by calling this method and by using R property. So let's assign it to Y. G property, let's assign it to Y. And blue property, and let's also assign it to Y. So what we did, we've just created the color in one of the iterations. You have to realize that Y in each of the iterations will be increased by 1. So that means that in the first iteration, Y will be 0 because we initiate it as 0. In the second iteration, it will become 1 and so forth. So basically, it will just grow 255 times. And there will be colors initialized for each iteration. So what we can do now is we can say colors push color into that array. So push is a magic keyword of this array that will put the color into the colors array one at a time. So it will this code will run 255 times, and we will be creating 255 colors, and we'll be adding all of them into this array. So with each iteration, the array will be expanding. Another thing that we also want to do is we want to create vectors, and let's do that in the same iteration. Okay, so let's do it with a similar way as we did with the color. Let's create a vector. Let's open up the square brackets, and let's say that our x coordinate is 0, y coordinate will be I divided by 30. We don't want to create points that go all the way to 255 because that's quite high. So I'll be dividing I in each iteration by 30. So that will scale the dimensions a little bit. And let's put z on 0. And that's it. Okay, so now we have a vector. And what we need to do with the vector, of course, is the same as we did with the colors. We need to push it to the vectors array. Now it's just complaining that it doesn't like that it's a number that is arbitrary. So basically there's a small type clash here. And what I will do is I will just assign this type of a point like this. This is just to make it easier to type. So basically this editor allows us to do this. And I'll say that this vector is also a 0.3. And now this also is protected in the way that we cannot add the fourth number in it and so forth. So basically this just helps us to make TypeScript happy and also protects us from potential mistakes. So we know now that to the vectors array we add a vector 255 times, and yeah, there will be quite a lot of points, right? So you can begin imagining that probably something will look like a line because it's so dense. So okay, let's try and run this code, but first we need to remember to draw what we've just did. So let's do that. Let's pass the entity, and let's say that the entity is vectors. If we only do that, then we will create the points, but we still need options. And options will be basic geometry options that we've seen before. So draw options will be new. Draw options colors will be assigned to colors. Okay, so now we can assign draw options here, and we can now run the code. And you see what happened is that we've created this gradient line that goes from 0 to 255 divided by whatever I said here, 30. So yeah, do the math yourselves how high that line went. But in fact, these are points. So if you zoom in closer, you'll see that this line is made out of points. So the problem here is more that you don't see the points, and this is due to the fact that our iteration is quite dense. You increase y every single time by 1, so you create 255 colors, and you also create 255 points. So in order to reduce that, I'll just say that I want to increase the y by 5 each time, till it reaches the value that is less than 255, or it hits it. So basically, this will reduce the amount of points naturally, because you will not be going and increasing y single unit. Now you'll be increasing it by 5 each time. This means that you will go to the same height, right? But your density of points will be decreased. So this is what happened. You see that we go from black to white. Also, another thing that is important here is this RGB description. The thing is that you see the R and G and B are all assigned to Y. This makes it so that the first iteration, R, G, and B are zeros. So you will create the point that is black, completely black. And 255 in the last iteration will create the point that is white. And that will be on the top. Everything in between will be a sort of gradient. So what we can do is we can just change a little bit. So it's not only black, but we go from something that is green to something that is white. This will be looking a bit better. So that's what we did, but it's also not visible very well. So let's increase the point size. And we did that already. Let's do 20. Okay, so now let's hit run, and you see that our points became lines again. But if we zoom in, there you see that our vertical line is basically starting with the green point and is made out of points that are looking much nicer than before. So if you rotate, okay, so I think you got the idea of how the for loop works, how to push items into arrays. That's what we did here. So here we also repeated a bit of what we did last time, except now we also learned how to push items into arrays that are empty. Before we were just initializing them like this, so we did these kinds of things. But this is not what we want here, right? The lengths of colors and vectors have to be equal for this code to work. Okay, so for this lecture, I think it's enough. Let's move on, and I hope you enjoyed it. Let's see each other in the next videos. Cheers.